So, welcome back, Nick Catalano. How you doing?
Doing fine, Jason. Great to be with you as always.
You were on a month or two ago. We had a really cool discussion. I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed listening to it. We talked a lot about jazz, about comedy, and other types of things that you've done throughout your life, a little bit of mine. I wanted to I've made some notes about that. So I wanted to come back to a couple of things you said that I wanted to ask you about, because there were a few things that really piqued my interest. One was that you mentioned Gilbert Gottfried, that because I'm a huge fan of Gilbert Gottfried. I
Oh
just
yeah.
think he's like, I think he had a kind of a genius. I don't know. I don't want to be exaggerate too much, but he had this mixture of lowbrow and dirty, but also he was really smart. He was like really smart, but also he kind of played dumb and he told really dirty jokes. I've read a lot about his upbringing, and I've heard him a lot on the Howard Stern show. I listened back on YouTube to those things, and I know he was also an artist as well, which I don't know if you know. And I want to just if you could just talk more about, you said you knew him quite well. I don't know if you,
Sure.
yeah.
Uh, Briefly, again, I'm trying to be a little bit chronological here. Uh, Way back in the early 70s, 73 to be the exact beginning. Uh, just before that, I was as a professor at Pace. I was made vice president for performing arts. So basically, what did that mean? We have lots of campuses. It meant that I would produce a season for the university in all of the arts. So I did dance, I did opera, I did drama, I did comedy, I did concerts and lectures, and you can imagine what a performing arts season is like.
Yeah.
And and because there are many campuses to the school, there were many events. One of the events that I wanted, in addition to all of the highbrow stuff, was something for the kids. Now, this goes back a lot of years, we're talking about 50 years ago. Uh, and comedy was making a kind of an interesting inroad in New York. But what I decided to do is to go to the two big showcases in New York, which were really kind of flexing their muscles at the time, the Improv and Catch a Rising Star. You know about them.
Yeah.
My good buddy from Juilliard, from when I was a child, was a pianist at both places. I mean, and this is a really tight friend, who's also I produced a lot of things with, and we've been in sort of different show business things for years. And he said to me, "Listen, there's a lot of really funny people here. You could do, a night of stand up, blah 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 blah." So yes, I did that, and I went to Bud Friedman, who owned the Improv. You know that name. And I
Mhm.
said, "Bud," he knew me, of course, because I had been in there many times. I said, "Bud, I want to do this." He said, "That's great." And I said, "I'd like to call it an evening at the Improv." And we still have the poster. So that's the first time that particular title was used, which it later
Okay.
became
Yeah.
a TV show, as you know. Uh,
Gilbert was there? Was he
no.
no.
This is way before. But Gilbert, I'm trying to give you some background. So
Okay.
from 73 on, I did at least 6 or 7 shows a year with
Wow.
4 or 5 comics per show.
Wow.
Okay. So you can see that this was going to be some sort of a crazy thing. What was I going to do here? What I did, I kept going into the clubs. They got to know me very well. They were very wonderful, but both Bud Friedman and Ricky Newman. And sure, they were thrilled because I said, "Look, I'm going to pay these guys," and they had never gotten any money before for doing the showcases, as you know. Bud was initially a little. He said, "What do you mean pay them?" I said, "Well, I
That's funny. He's a club owner, right? So he's like, oh
right,
man, this is
right,
gonna bankrupt me. He's thinking, right? I'm gonna pay all these
right,
guys, right?
right.
Yeah.
So anyway, and the line of celebrity entertainers, comics, etc., at these clubs, it never ends.
Yeah.
I mean, all the people on Broadway used to come in for different things.
Wow.
Names, forget about it. It goes on and on and on and on. You name a name, and they were there for these things. So, I'm stopping for a second. Any questions so far?
No,
No.
this is really cool. Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you. Yeah.
So we started. and the tradition was a kind of a crazy tradition. A limo would show up in front of Catch a Rising Star on a Friday night, and whoever was in town, okay, who knew Nick, everybody knew Nick at this point, whoever was in town would call me and say, okay, I'll do the show. So what we would do is meet in the limo outside of Catch, go and do the gig, get back to the club maybe about 10:30 or 11 so they could all do their midnight showcases, and then hang out and maybe have a bite to eat and talk about things and so on. This went on for 25 years.
Okay, wow.
So I'm giving you all of that because I don't know that there's a comic that I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. They all worked my shows. Gilbert must have done a dozen shows. Jerry, Bill Maher, Larry, the whole scene was on and on and on. And they loved doing the shows because they were in front of college kids who in the 70s were able to still drink. So you can imagine how riotous some of these evenings were. And I say riotous. I can tell you this, in the limo rides to the Westchester campuses of the university, with 4 or 5 of these clowns in the back jumping on one another's lines, the laughter became so intense.
Yeah.
I remember at least twice when Rick and I had to stop the limo to go out of the limo on the Somerville Parkway to go to the bathroom, ladies and gentlemen. That's how crazy this got in the car.
So
what can I tell you?
I'm just wondering. So I want to drill a little bit on Gottfried. He, like you're saying, a number of interesting things. One is that there was a lot of college kids, like university students, which I don't know if you know, comics today, Jerry Seinfeld won't do universities now.
No,
he won't do them because, you know, there's this whole cancel culture, you know, and all this stuff. So,
well, we're talking about a long, long time ago. When I started this, 73 is a long, long time ago.
Well, it sounds like a much freer campus than we see today, just from what you're describing, right?
It was much freer. Plus, the fact is, I guess it's fair to say, because I had spent a lot of my time in my life in music and show business and shows and things like that. And so there were a lot of things that were left unsaid. Everybody trusted Nick. They knew I was going to pay them. They knew everything was great. This was a wonderful series. The word got out very quickly. So it just went on. Yeah. Gilbert was in the second wave. I wrote a book called New York Nights.
Mm-hmm.
It's a not large, I don't know what it is. It's 200 or 300 pages. It's basically one of the several autobiographical kinds of things. It's the story of Nick in New York as a writer, as a producer, as a musician. Okay, and there are a billion stories in that book. I would love you to read parts of it because that will stimulate you for more questions. And There are there's 3 chapters there on stand-up comedy, what I began to call observation comedy. And Gilbert was in the second section. So Gilbert started working for Nick roughly, let's say 1981, 82 or 3 or something like that. And he did as many shows as everybody, and they all did dozens of shows. Gilbert, of course, immediately appealed, his work with all these crazy voices, all of these very surreptitious allusions. Actually, and I don't suppose anybody knows this, I know Gilbert really well, and he's a conservative, quiet guy who is married with 2 lovely kids. He passed away, of course, a couple of years ago, which was really, really sad. But I mean,
quite young. I mean, I think he was in his early 60s when he passed last year.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, as many comics are, certainly to the uneducated eye, I mean, to people who don't know them, they're very schizophrenic people. They may go on and be the funniest thing in the world, but many times they're very quiet. They're very,
it's
solitary people.
I mean, it's something they're presenting to the world, right? It's we talked a bit about this with, I think, Dangerfield. Dangerfield was sort of a great example of this, where all of his body movements, and you said, I think you mentioned how you played squash with him or something, and how he was quite different in person. I think, wasn't that?
Yeah, in the 70s, we all started working out because you needed to be in shape. So there was the very first health club in New York City in Manhattan was the New York Health and Racquet Club on 76th Street, and that's where I went to start. My dad had passed away. I think I needed to make sure I stayed in shape, so I started, and I've been going every 3 times a week for all those years. Anyway, Rodney swam. That's what he did. He was there swimming every day.
Okay.
And so I would see him. I went 3 times a week. I would see him 3 times a week. He was there 5 times a week.
And he was quite different. He was, I mean,
very quiet,
yeah,
extremely quiet. A couple of times when he worked for me, which was very unusual because he, at that point in the 70s, was very famous.
Yeah.
And he wasn't doing colleges and so on. And it really wasn't until maybe 81 or 82 or 83 or whatever in there that he said, yeah, Nick, I'll do one of your shows, because he knew me. Yeah, he was a quiet guy. I mean,
from what I understand about him, he had a life up through of, like, he was not famous, and he worked very hard on his comedy throughout his 20s and 30s, and then he got famous when he was in middle age, apparently, which by then, I mean, he was, you know, he was a previous generation, but he's been an enormous influence, I think, when I think about Rodney Dangerfield.
he had an extraordinarily, we won't go into this, he had an extraordinarily crazy childhood, truly terrible.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
But the thing about Rodney, and I'll talk about Rodney and Jerry Seinfeld particularly, these comics are scholars. They work and write almost every day, putting in hours and hours and hours, and even when they're not performing, they're writing.
Yeah.
People don't understand that. This is almost
the work,
a professorial kind of an activity.
Yeah.
And it's the way they are. I mean, in the book, in the New York Knights book, I wrote about the beginnings. We call it observation comedy, very different from, you and I talked about this.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, but
it became different, and I obviously was not able to impart obviously any humor, but they were always interested in the fact that I was teaching a history of comedy in all these different literatures. And we got into some wild discussions about all of that in terms of timing and irony and allusions. And I mean, it's pretty sophisticated stuff what they were doing.
I actually have a couple of questions about that, because that leads me to, it makes me think. I mean, you have what Aristotle wrote, Poetics and different things where he talked about how to formulate comedy. There's ancient Greek literature. There were comedies in ancient Greece as well. How would we know about the timing if it, like, we were not there to watch it? So I wonder.
Yeah, but the scholarship is readily available. We're talking about the 5th century BC, and in the 5th century, in the late 5th century, the comic tradition, which had already started, begins to feature Aristophanes. Okay, you've heard of the birds, the clouds, and Aristophanes is really the first person to use all sorts of interesting kinds of dramatic irony for comedy and timing. Do you know the play Lysistrata?
I've heard of it. I've never actually read it. Yeah, maybe you can talk about it. Yeah.
As we all said years ago, this is the funniest play ever written. Why?
Yeah.
Basically, what is it about? It's an first of all, it's an anti-war play, which is amazing. It's a comedy. It features the women of Sparta and Athens who are sick and tired and pissed off at the Peloponnesian War. Okay, they've had it. This is how the play starts. So what are they going to do in order to stop these mighty warriors from Sparta and Athens and so on? They're going to go on a sex strike.
I've heard of this. Yeah.
Okay. So now I've actually directed this play a couple of times because it's just such an important play. It sounds silly and crazy, but it's extremely seminal. Anyway, so the big scene in the play is a scene which, for the stand-up comics that I'm talking to, they love it because it's filled with dramatic irony and allusions and all the things that they do. It's the same thing. It's funny. Comedy is comedy is comedy. In the big scene in the play, there's a big wall in front of Athens, and the women are all sitting on the top of the wall with their dalliances, looking very sexy. And on the stage, walking on the stage in their mighty warrior costumes, you can picture this, are all of the warriors and leaders and famous, so-called famous Spartans and Athenians. And every one of them has erections as they're walking on the stage. So when I say it's the funniest, it's the greatest sight gag ever done. I mean, as soon as you describe it, you say to yourself, "Holy
it's hilarious." Yeah. I just have a technical question. I don't know if you can answer this, but is it known how that was done? Like, did they go nude and actually have erections? I mean, is that, I don't know.
Absolutely.
They actually had erections. They were men with erections.
Well,
yeah. So it's almost pornographic in a certain sense.
Well,
almost. I mean, I'm not making a criticism. I'm just, it's very dirty stuff, right? I mean,
Greek drama and Greek comedy is like we could do 60 podcasts.
Yeah,
there's a lot of information. There's over 1,000 presentations just at the Acropolis in the 5th century of plays. 1,000.
Wow. Yeah, it's amazing.
And when I'm teaching this, and I've taught it for almost 60 years, there's no end to it. And some of the names that you mentioned are seminal names. I mean, these people knew what to do about drama and theater in ways that our people still don't know. And when I would talk about some of these things to the guys, they would keep their mouths shut and sit there and listen and take notes, because comedy is comedy.
Well, I can imagine Gilbert Gottfried taking something like that and just, you know what I mean? Him and Howard Stern, or him and Artie Lang, and just going with the thing about the erections, and it would just be absolutely hilarious,
Well, once again, they were always, depending upon their particular level of genius, and some of these guys we're talking about are the kings of comedy. I mean, these guys know what they're doing backwards.
Yeah.
In terms of timing and sound and rhythms and allusions and all sorts of different references and biographical. I mean, all of this stuff is very complex.
I agree. And it's very interesting. You're bringing in this, this thing about Greek comedy. One of the things I've noticed with some people like Gottfried and Howard Stern is that they're from a certain generation, and they all seem to have grown up watching a lot of television, like comedic, Jackie Gleason and all this kind of stuff. It's almost like there was no such thing as a comedy school, but they observed very carefully that structure, and they really integrated it into what they did. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but
yeah, sure. Because first of all, here in New York, we're in New York here. Okay. So they have, forget about what you just said, that there's all of that, but they have the Catskill Mountains tradition.
Yeah.
And so all of the older comics, some of whom began to develop an approach just like the younger guys did, with observations. I'm talking about people like, I don't know if you know these names. I worked up in the mountains as a kid musician 100 years ago. So I knew all these guys, these older guys, Freddie Roman,
Frankie Roman,
Mal Z. Lawrence, oh my God, Jerry Lewis. I mean,
Jerry Lewis. Well, there's a huge name, and Frankie Roman is known.
And in all those hotels up there in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, that's where those older guys started. So the tradition of stand-up here in New York is pregnant with all sorts of names. And these guys, some of these same guys that I'm just mentioning now, would come into the Improv. Freddie Roman keeps asking me again, Nicky, when are you going to keep doing this? And Freddie is 180 years old now, I think.
He's still alive.
He might not be.
Well, it's pretty incredible if he made it into the 21st century.
But I mean, I'm talking about these guys as if they were my close buddies. And I have to tell you that what I was doing, starting in that time, I was finishing my work at Pace, teaching and coaching football and directing shows and musicals and whatever. And before I went home at night, I would go to the clubs, spend maybe a half an hour talking business, auditioning whoever happened to be there. And of course, the auditions were silly because they were all incredibly funny guys and gals. That's the way it went down. I mean, and it was just a laboratory for stand-up comedy, plus the tradition of what I had just said to you, the Catskills.
Yeah. We
Man.
talked a little bit about that, sort of the vaudeville and the Catskills, the Jewish comics last time. I'm wondering if you can speak. I don't know how much you might know about this, but a lot of I mentioned a minute ago these shows like the Honeymooners and all that stuff, that those comics, that generation, the Gilbert Gottfried we're watching. That stuff also it was from New York, and I mean, how intertwined is all of that? Yeah.
Unfortunately, Jason, when I talk in these interviews, and I've been doing them for 50 years, sometimes it sounds like I'm name dropping, and I really don't. I really don't.
Please, you mentioned this last time, and please don't apologize for it. You should brag about knowing these people.
Well,
it's amazing.
Yeah, but I mean, it sounds so silly sometimes and superficial. However, Jackie Gleason, when I was a kid at Juilliard, his director of his band was a guy named Sammy Spears. Sammy was the director of the Jackie Gleason Orchestra. So by the time I was in the Union when I was 11,
wow.
By the time I was 12 or 13, I don't know, right in around there, Sammy said, listen, I'll get you a couple of shows. It was live television here in New York, 5 o'clock rehearsal, 8 o'clock hit. And, we would get like triple scale. So I did maybe 7 or 8 or 10 shows as a child, as a kid. I was playing.
This is as a musician. You were playing saxophone or
all the reeds.
Sax, okay.
Clarinet,
all
that flute.
For the Jackie Gleason for the Honeymooners.
No. For the band on the TV show.
The band on the TV show. Okay.
Which played for the dancers, played for the guests, played for everybody. Okay.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah.
And another thing, Jackie was nowhere near this. He had no knowledge of music at all. But Sammy pitched Jackie and said, we'd like to do some recordings. So, segue, from the 50s, there are 4 Columbia recordings, the Jackie Gleason Orchestra, which for like about 15 years were the best-selling albums in Columbia. Bobby Hackett on trumpet and strings, and it sounds almost like elevator music, except it's brilliantly arranged and nicely performed. Up until a few years ago, I still got royalty checks.
Right? Wow, that's great.
So the Jackie, New York guy, went to school here in New York, a very good comic, as you know, great actor, etc. Was not a hanger-outer, didn't really do stand-up in clubs and so much at all. He was very theatrical, and he was a wonderful actor. He was nominated for awards all the time for his acting.
Yeah, from what I understand about Jackie Gleason, he seems to be an enormous influence on, like when I listen to other actors, like, just it's almost a dumb example, but the guys from The Sopranos, Michael Imperioli and the big guy, I forget his name, they had a podcast where they talked about The Sopranos, and those two guys constantly would bring up the Honeymooners as like some of the greatest things that they'd ever seen. And, it's so influential, it's really...
Well, if I Love Lucy, which goes back to 1950, if those reruns are going on 73 years later, and they'll keep
gotta say something, right?
Yeah, these shows. Seinfeld. How long will Seinfeld go on until the planet burns?
It seems like Seinfeld was the, my generation, let's say, a bit older than me. Seinfeld was older than me himself, but when I was coming up in my 20s, that was the Honeymooners of our time was,
right.
And it's interesting the differences that when you observe the two shows, the way that the 50s, they're sort of these married couples, right, living in little apartments in New York, and then in the 90s it was these single people, and you see sort of these social differences that play out, but those are far less important than the deep comedy in there. And I've heard too that Jackie Gleason, he was an incredible actor, but he never rehearsed. He had something where he would not rehearse, and Seinfeld's father on Seinfeld was his stand-in. I don't know if you remember that his name was Barney, something, this big, huge guy.
Yeah, right.
Played his father, and he would stand in because Jackie Gleason would refuse to rehearse for reasons unclear to me. He didn't like rehearsing.
That may be true. I can only tell you that there were 4 o'clock rehearsals for the show, and I was on maybe 6. Let's say I was on between 6 and 10 shows, which is not a lot. but I never saw him not rehearse. They always
Oh,
rehearsed.
that's interesting. So that was, yeah, that was an interview with Jerry Seinfeld where he said there was the stand-up. Maybe he didn't rehearse this, but I don't know. It's interesting. It could be like, I wonder, some actors and some comedians might want to have a kind of spontaneity. They might want to bring something rather than sort of overdoing the rehearsing, just come on and do something. I don't know. There's different theories about how to um
It gets very complex, Jason, as you know. Sometimes, yeah, there's a lot of free form, and if there are comics together, uh,
yeah, yeah.
forget it. I mean, one's punchline will suggest something to another one,
Yeah,
and then that will
yeah.
suggest, and before you know it, I mean, that's what happened in the cars. It happened on a couple of radio shows we were on also, that were absolutely incredible.
Did you ever think to record some of those, maybe with
I
their
have, I have,
permission? Do you
I
have
have,
some? Because those
yeah,
must be fantastic.
yeah. I haven't even looked at them in years, but I have
Because you could
video
probably
that
sell them. I mean, you know, I mean, I don't mean, I mean, you could get the rights from Bill Maher. I don't know, because I tell you, well, when I listen to Norm Macdonald and Tom Green just talking like it's on the Tom, they're just having a conversation. It is so funny, and it's exactly as you say. They just kind of go off each other, and you know, there's something about comedy that seems to be very high intelligence. There's kind of like, it's a way of spotting people who have a sense of humor. I think there's the timing, but there's also kind of, you want to look for something that someone hasn't seen that might create laughter, right? It's kind of something
well,
unexpected,
yeah,
right?
and there's many sources. I mean, again, I wrote about this, and other people have written about it much more precisely than I have. All of the elements that go into not just stage comedy, but into, you know, things like stand-up comedy or vaudeville or any of these performance things, they get to be very complex. When you start analyzing all this stuff, it gets to be almost dumb academic, because it's just
Yeah.
it's so complex. There's so many weapons that they have to choose. Their voices, their time. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But the discussions with them and when they're working uh, become pretty interesting. There's a comic. You probably don't know him. His name is Bill Sheft, and
I've heard the name. Yeah, I've heard the name. Yeah.
Bill, amazing guy. Bill was hired the first day that David Letterman went to CBS, and left the last day that David was on television. That's how great a writer Bill
Wow.
was.
Wow.
Bill was Bill was the last Latin major at Harvard.
I think you talked about him. That was, I remember this. He was the
I,
last
I,
one to graduate.
I
Yeah.
told you the whole story about introducing him with all these Latin references, et cetera, et cetera. So the more specific, the more, if you will, esoteric some of the humor got, the funnier it was sometimes. With Gilbert Gottfried, I mean, some of those references that Gilly makes are pretty esoteric.
Really? Really?
Yeah, I
I've
mean,
never noticed that with him.
well,
Yeah.
when he doing stuff, television is one thing, but when you're in the club, the club things
Mhm.
were very interesting and were different than that. Live performances. What can you say? There's a comic that nobody knows. His name is Lenny Schultz, the funniest comic of all of them, and nobody knows him.
Yeah.
I mean, there's irony here that you can't believe. Nobody would follow Lenny on stage. He was a clown. He was he could do things. I can't even summarize his stuff because he was just so funny. If you ever see any allusions, he
Lenny
was on.
Schultz.
Yeah, he was on
Lenny
Laughing a
Schultz.
few times. He did a lot of television, but the television that he did doesn't even begin
Oh,
to
that's interesting.
illustrate his great talent.
So there was something
Amazing.
about him in person, like when you were there, that was not captured by the cameras. Is that
Not only that, but look at
yeah?
the censorship. Look at the censorship. There's
Right.
only,
Right. Yeah.
that's the big thing. That's the big thing. But
Yeah.
on Laughing, I mean, he does things, etc. And I mean, they were just absolutely so hysterical. They were beyond description. You can't describe some of these comics because what your description is, no matter how brilliant it may be, it's nowhere near as funny as they are.
Yeah. So was he influential on other comics? Like, was he?
Not really,
No.
because he was such a clown. He was extraordinarily well-built, good-looking guy who could
Oh,
put on
interesting.
plastic faces that would make you so hysterically funny. He had a plastic face. He
Wow.
could do things with his face. He had allusions that were incredible, satires. And when he worked in a club, it wasn't vanilla and chocolate. I mean, there were all sorts of different kinds of allusions, and that's what I'm talking about. With those kinds of things, it was amazing. People would not like at the Friars in L.A. one night, 100 years ago. Milton Berle, Red Buttons, Norm Crosby. There was a fight backstage at the Friars. Nobody would follow Lenny Schultz.
Right, right.
That's how
He's
funny he
too
was.
good. Yeah, you're
Nobody
gonna
would
stink. Yeah.
nobody would dare go on stage after this guy. So
That's
you see,
hilarious.
and nobody knows who he is.
So just to explain to listeners what that means, because some people might not understand, that's a show business reference where if someone is incredibly good on stage, they blow it out of the water. If you go on after, you're gonna, no matter how good you are, you're gonna look like you're stinking it up, right? I mean, you could be, right?
Yeah, I produced a show. Oh my God, I can't even remember. This goes back. Phyllis Diller is the headliner. This is a live show, a week. And the opener is the greatest impressionist, whose name I can't think of, but you'll know who it is. Anyway, a week, Phyllis was a big star. This impressionist that I'm talking about, I can't think of his name, but he was on Carson 1,000 times. He destroyed the audience. And when she came on, she was nowhere near as funny as he was.
Interesting.
Now
Yeah.
this went on for a week, and I'm in the band, and it's like, holy smoke! But those kinds of things happen, occasionally. There's so much unpredictability when it comes to all of this. Show business is very effective, as you know that. I mean, my God.
Yeah. It's interesting because it's very hard to predict what people are going to like. And comedians and musicians it's a very tough business. And every once in a while, somebody seizes onto something that becomes a huge thing that nobody predicts. And then, and it's interesting. And it's partly because, I mean, I had a musician, a guy I know on, Sonny Greenwich, and he was talking about how part of it is, I mean, with music at least, I hear music differently from how you hear. Everybody hears it in a subjective fashion, and yet popular music, for example, and popular comedy too, you're trying to make something like a situation comedy that's going to appeal to millions of people, right? Which is almost by definition extremely hard because of because a lot of comedy is subjective, right? It's something that I will laugh at, you might not laugh at, right?
Personal experience, yeah, sure. I mean, the more universal, which is one of the reasons why in a city like New York, I mean, there are so many people, so many different backgrounds, so many different situations for allusions and references and things like that. So that's one of the reasons why there's so much of it here. Although I have to tell you that after the 70s, with Catch a Rising Star and the Improv were both licensed for national franchises, and they
never really went anywhere, right?
There were many of them all over the country. Those guys did great. I mean,
Well, they did well. Yeah, the comedians who went through that did really well. Jerry Seinfeld is probably the greatest alumnus of that, right?
Jerry, what can I tell you? Jerry is a really, really close friend. And I've known Jerry. Jerry's what now, 67, I think.
You said he was your neighbor in the Hamptons? I'm curious to know more about that.
Well, I've been in the Hamptons forever. I have a house there, and Jerry's been there for 20 years.
I wanted, maybe I could ask you, because that was something else I noted down was, I mean, you're friends with him. He strikes me that is he that different, his public persona from his private person? I mean, it looks like it's probably somewhat similar, but I mean, again, you know him, right? I don't know.
Well, he's always been a very, very quiet guy. I mean, even his comedy is quiet, you might
subdued,
say.
Yeah.
I mean, when he first started, and everybody in New York, I'm exaggerating, of course, that knew I was producing comedy all over the place. they'd call me and say, "Hey, Nick, we need a comic for this, for that," and people would call all the time because. So, and many times they'd call and they'd say, "Listen, we're having a wedding or a bar mitzvah or something like that. We want a comic, but we got to have a comic that doesn't say fuck." Who is that?
Send Jerry Seinfeld, right?
And I said, "There's a kid from Massapequa here who's just hysterical." And so I would send Jerry out for his $150 gigs or whatever. And he adores that time because he enjoyed that a lot. And that's when he first started to write and to work. But Jerry's academic. He writes 3 days a week, even if he doesn't perform for 6 months. He's out there writing. That's what he does.
He talks a lot about how he has this great discipline, and he gets up every day and just starts writing jokes and trying to formulate material, and he's come out very publicly, almost insulting. There's a famous case where he went after actors. It was at an awards ceremony where he went on about how we venerate these actors for really not doing very much compared to comedians. He pointed out how comedians have to actually write all this material that people have to laugh at, right? Whereas I don't know if that's fair, because being an actor is actually probably pretty hard, right? But
I'm not sure what you're talking about. I haven't heard this.
Yeah, he went on a long screen. It's very funny. I mean, it was an awards show, and he made a joke at the end that the only reason I can say all these insulting things is because I won all these awards, and all this stuff. But he basically said actors are just basically pretending they're repeating lines they're told, which is true, right? I mean, that's what it's, and that doesn't take away from the greatness of some great actors out there who can really perform in a certain way, but he's making a case that the creativity involved in show business, such as comedy or even writers of drama, is more important than those who are in front of the camera, and that we respect the beautiful faces more. I don't know.
I avoid those arguments. Those things go nowhere. I mean, what are you going to say? There certainly is an enormous amount of skill that goes into great acting, as well as, I don't know what point he was making, but I would have called him on it immediately.
Oh yeah. Well, it's I mean, it's a
Jerry happens to be an extremely bright person. Queens College graduate. When he was in school, he did extremely well. And many times in other contexts besides comedy, I've had him in conversations that illustrate his truly great mind. He's got a wonderful mind.
So he's very, like, in person, he likes to have complex sort of intellectual discussions. Like, he's educated. Is that, I don't want to insult him, but
no, I don't know.
By calling him intellectual, but
I say I've said intellectual, but that connotes, unfortunately,
some highbrow thing that obviously he's not.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
He was around comedy as a kid. His father knew everybody and so on, and he was around. He says he's a student. He's a marvelous student. I mean, what can I say? He can make things. He and Larry can make things that are extraordinarily ordinary funny.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're making a case about him and Larry David too, that it's observational, but it's also, there's an intelligence linked with an openness and a curiosity, it sounds like, right?
Well, again, remember that these are guys born and raised in this great show business tradition here in New York. I mean, so as children, as teenagers, I mean, they're constantly exposed to so much of this.
Yeah.
And when they decided that this is what they were going to do, Larry, we used to make fun of Larry all the time. Larry was a terrible stand-up comic.
That's what I've heard. He's famous for that. That he would get up and he would berate the audience. Sometimes.
Yeah, he would get into arguments and screaming, and of course we were all on the floor laughing, but not the audience.
Yeah,
and that's why he got into writing. And quite frankly, I'm telling you some like tale out of school here now, but Larry has always preferred to perform rather than write.
Is that right?
Yeah, and he's not a good performer. He's just not good in front of a camera. I mean,
what about his show though? I mean, his show is a really interesting thing where he's acting, but he's not. It's like he took Seinfeld was supposed to be that, but he kind of took that and really amped it up to a different level in a certain sense. Because he's not really like that.
When you talk
He's
about,
not that selfish and venal and right? I mean, I don't know.
well, when you talk about that show, that's almost not even television. That's like just Larry and his experiments, and that's the way he is. I mean, he can take something that's incredibly funny. You know, if we're sitting down and there are two pencils on the table, and I say, "Gee, this one is sharper than the other one," he can make it funny. He
Right,
can make stuff like
right.
that funny.
Yeah.
I mean, he's got incredible ability to do that. When he was on Saturday Night Live, he paid some dues. Then he got a show that lasted less than a year on ABC called Fridays. And it was the feeble attempt to emulate Saturday night. But he was in charge of Fridays, and he got a lot of experience with the network, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So when he and Jerry got together and started to plan Seinfeld, which is, you've heard this story a million times, he knew exactly how the deals were made. He knew exactly what pressure points. When the third year came around, and Seinfeld started out very poor.
Yeah, very bad ratings in the first couple of years. It was very much an experiment. I mean,
they wanted to get one. By the time the third year came and they were ready for renewal, well, Larry had said to Jerry, "We are not signing anything in terms of the residuals. We're going to wait." And so when that came around, and the big deal, when I won't even mention how much money is involved in it. It's unimaginable. Imagine unimaginable amount of money they put in their pocket because of this, and because Larry knew.
So this is really interesting. I think a lot of people don't know that about Larry David. Like we know Larry David a little bit from Seinfeld and then from his show. We know that he created Seinfeld, and like most people, I think, who are fans of comedy know that he was a comedian who was, a little bit raucous. But this thing about, I knew that he had written for Saturday Night Live, but that he had never actually had anything, like none of his skits had ever gotten on the air or something. He had a terrible time. Yeah.
A couple of them did. That's a bit of a circus, that place. Actually, I haven't got an enormous knowledge. I know Lorne Michaels, of course, but I never really watched that show. And the reason I never did is because I was always laughing so hard in the live shows that I was doing constantly.
Why watch Saturday Night Live when you can actually watch real comics?
That stuff isn't funny compared to what I'm seeing. I mean, my God, it's hard to describe the intensity of the laughter. I'm using these examples as I've given you, but it's wild.
Yeah, no, it's
Larry's parents, Mr. and Mrs. David, are exactly the people that you see as George Costanza's parents on the show. Okay, they are. That's exactly who they are. They could come into the club and start screaming at one another because you didn't open the door for them, and they constantly screamed. That's how Larry was raised.
So Estelle and Frank, who were played by Jerry Stiller, and I forget the woman's name. They were just incredible. Those actors in those roles.
Yeah, incredible. Jerry, as you know, was doing his thing with his wife. They had that wonderful comedy team also, and I can remember their son, who's a big movie star now, when he was walking around in diapers. That's how long I've been around.
Yeah. Okay. So this basically, I wanted to know, this is interesting what you're saying about Seinfeld. I didn't mean to use the word intellectual in a pejorative sense. I mean, I was trying to, it sounds like, I mean, I can see the deep intellectualism with him. With Larry David, I see when you're just, a kind of a humbler background. I mean, I don't know if he went to university. I don't know anything about his background.
Well, again, I'm almost sorry I mentioned university in the context, because bright people are bright people. These people were drowned in comedy from their childhoods. Comedy is their life, and so even when there are so-called serious discussions Again, I tell the story when I'm teaching. When I was teaching Liz Estrada, there were 12 comics sitting at the table. Nobody was saying a word. They wanted to know exactly what dramatic irony was all about. They wanted to know exactly what the con. So they're very serious people when it comes to their craft. This is how they make their living.
Yeah, I think that it's a common misconception that comedians kind of like it's this sort of lackadaisical, kind of like it. The reality is, first of all, many of them, as you pointed out earlier, with Gilbert Gottfried and I'm blanking on his name, the older one, who was on Johnny Carson all the time. God darn it! Anyway,
Rodney Dangerfield.
Rodney Dangerfield, right? Many of them actually, it's actually a front. I mean, Gilbert Gottfried, from what I understand, I mean, everything you mentioned, his voices, he was famous for his voice and for other voices that he did. Apparently, he didn't. I mean, it's true that he didn't talk that way, right?
No, not at all. And
Yeah.
what people don't understand is that when these guys go on stage, all of them who are successful are extremely serious about what they're doing and in preparation. The voices, the timing, the ideas that they have for different situations in different clubs. I mean, they could very easily make a discussion of comedy into a college classroom discussion easily.
Totally. Yeah. It looks spontaneous. Like when you're watching a stand-up comedian, it kind of, I mean, he's telling jokes, he's rehearsed something, and there's things that might look spontaneous interacting with the crowd, but they're based on experience and sort of previous things where they've crafted things in certain ways. How many times does a comic have to bomb before they can be like, every great comic has bombed at some point in their career, right? I mean,
it's so funny, yeah, and it happens all the time. At the Improv, there was a bartender who had a partner, and they would go on and they had auditioned and they would go on and performed, and they weren't very funny. And but Bud said to Chris one day, he said, "Look," and Chris, they had performed for me once, and it didn't matter what they did with me because the kids would laugh at anything, literally anything. I said, "Yeah, I guess." I said, "Look, it's not as funny as some of the other stuff. What can I tell you?" Anyway, Chris went on to become the president of HBO.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And as such, when he became president, HBO was showing wrestling. That was what they were doing back 35 or 40 years ago. He made it into the network that it became, with the shows, the comedy, the permissiveness, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, that kind of stuff happened. But everybody, even though he wasn't funny, he understood it. He hired me. He hired me about 10 years ago to do a show on Star. He left HBO after a while. Some embarrassing things happened. But he became president of Stars. And he said, "Nicky, there's a producer here that's doing a show on Leonardo da Vinci. He wants to talk to you." So I spoke to this guy. I did some things for him, and he produced this show on Leonardo in Florence. It became a series, and it was as intellectual as anything you'd ever want to see in your life.
On HBO. It was on HBO.
No, it was on Stars.
Stars, right? Yeah. HBO really revolutionized television, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
So he was instrumental.
He was the president. He made it all happen. I mean,
wow. So was he around when The Sopranos got signed?
Well, this is way before The Sopranos.
Before The Sopranos, okay.
Way before.
Yeah, okay.
Talking about the late 70s, early 80s.
Okay, so HBO goes back that far. Wow. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Interesting. I didn't know. I understood, as I recall, HBO.
Tempest is fugiting.
Right. I mean, I understand like its home box office. So I understand its original mission was to bring films to television way back in the day, right?
It wasn't just films. It was whatever they could do to draw it away. And wrestling, which is still a big thing on television.
Yeah.
I believe it or not, they have numbers on some of these wrestling shows that I can't believe it when my friends out in Hollywood, and it's true. I mean, it's been going on for 70 years.
It's huge. Wrestling's enormous. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting how big wrestling is, and it's one of these it's a bit like country music is the biggest selling music form. It's one of these things that it's hugely popular among sort of working people and kind of, there's a whole strata. It's not like a big sort of sexy thing that we think about, but it's
Right.
Rick Rubin has talked a lot about wrestling, about how it's this constant drama that it's unfolding over years and changing over time. And he's got the very interesting comments about that. And I didn't know HBO was involved in wrestling. That's the news.
Oh yeah, that's how it started, and not just HBO, but Showtime, a couple of the others, and so on. But now here we are. Well, here we are. What, 35 years later? I mean, this is a whole different world.
Yeah.
Jason, I have. Speaking of HBO, I have an executive from Warner Communications
calling you. Wow. Okay.
Going to call. No, soon.
Soon.
In another 10 minutes.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
We can do these things. We could do them together. I wanted to even do one myself.
Sure.
I don't know if I'll ever have time to do that. And you and I have, my God, we've canceled and back and forth.
Yeah, I apologize. That was some scheduling issues we had. Yeah,
me too. Could we think about this? Maybe co-producing one or two of these things. Let me know what your thoughts are, because I don't want to do all of the work that you've done. I have stuff in my office here, which I mean, I can't even begin to tell. Let me just show you. What do I have here?
You got different. Okay.
I don't know. I don't even know what this is.
Yeah, microphone. You got okay.
Yeah, I got special mics. I got this, that, the other thing. So I have all the equipment, I guess. I don't know. Anyway,
one thing I wanted just to close out the conversation with you now, because I know you got to go, is I really think these conversations are really interesting, because they're kind of you're recounting these stories about all these amazing people. And I also want to say our friend and producer Rob Lewis pointed out about the name dropping, because I asked him about this, and he made this interesting distinction. He said name dropping would be if I go to a club, downtown, and there's Bruce Springsteen's in there or something, and I'm sitting next to him, and I go, "Hey, Bruce, how you doing?" And we talk for 2 minutes, and then later I say, "Yeah, me and Bruce, we hang out all the time." That's name dropping. But you're not name dropping, because you actually know all these people. Like, they're like friends. Like, they really are friends.
Well, yeah, let's end with one story if we can.
Sure. Yeah.
As far as that's concerned, I hired them. I love them. I will owe them my life for the laughter. But to be honest with you, I was never really one of them. I'm one of these people, Jason, who doesn't belong anywhere. I do too many disparate kinds of things, and so when they first did this, when they first went on and they made the deal, et cetera, and Jerry, Jerry and Larry are doing the show. It's on NBC, blah, blah, blah. And by the second or third year, when I would run into them, or we would talk about whatever the heck this was, because I'm doing a million things, that it got to be a hit. So Jerry said, "Hey, Nick, we're going to put your name on a show." And I said, "Oh my God."
Nice.
I said, wait a second, because they knew, let's put it this way, they knew about my rather complex life in ways that I don't really want everybody to know. And so I said,
so you declined.
What are these guys going to do? I was going to get crazy. What are these guys? So the conversation ended. They did their show. I didn't even see it. And then somebody said to me, "Hey, Nick, did you see the Seinfeld show?" Blah, 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 blah. So I said, "No, I didn't." So they sent it to me, and I thought, "Oh my God, what the hell are they going to say about Nick Catalano that the world is now going to hear, that's going to really get me into who knows what?" So it's a show, you'll see it. It's one of their famous shows. They're in a Chinese restaurant and they can't get in. The waiter won't let the
that's a famous episode. Yeah,
right, exactly. So they're standing outside. And a woman comes in and she says, "Hi, Jerry, how are you? I love you. I haven't seen you in such a long time." And he doesn't know her name.
Okay.
He's forgotten her name. So he's standing there with Elaine, blah, blah, blah. Finally, the introduction comes, and Elaine says, "My name is Elaine Venice." And she says, "My name is blankety blank Catalano."
Okay.
I thought, oh God, thank God. I thought they were going to get crazy, because let me tell you, I mean, I got stories that will put you on the floor about situations that I was in with Larry and Jerry that are so absolutely hysterical. They could be front page stories. That's how insanely funny these guys are.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, that's a really cool one that you have an Easter egg in one of the most famous.
Yeah, and I didn't even see the show because I was so
That's
busy.
hilarious. That's great. Okay, well, listen. So we'll close it out for today. Next time we meet, if you could maybe just some of those stories about Larry and Jerry. I mean, you just want to recount them.
A million, and we can do jazz. We can do a lot of different things. Let me know, and
Sure.
we'll see how we can do
co-produce.
this.
I'll be on my podcast. You'll be on my podcast, and I'll be on your. Maybe I'll be your first guest or something. I don't know.
Whatever, but I'd like to do it together with somebody, and you're perfect.
Okay, thank you.
I'll
take that as a great compliment. Thanks, Nick. I'll see you on the next one.
It is, Jason, and thank you for your persistence and your organization. I admire it. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.